The Black Death, also known as the Black Plague, was a devastating bacterial plague that thrived in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East between the 13th and 17th century, with recurring outbreaks in the 18th and 19th century. There were three stages of the plague: the bubonic plague stage, the pneumonic plague stage, and the septemic plague stage. The plague initially appeared as a series of large blisters on the lymph glands called buboes, and they varied in size from the size of an egg to the size of an apple. This was the bubonic stage of the plague. It would then go into the pneumatic stage with signs of high fever, shortness of breath, vomiting. Then the buboes would then ooze pus out, which was considered to be the start of the septemic stage. The victim would also suffer blood clotting in the limbs, which would turn the limbs black and gangrenous, and then suffer from shock and bleeding from the skin. Most victims then died between 2 to 7 days after the initial infection. So how does one get the Black Death? As the bubonic plague is bacterial in nature, it requires the victim to be infected with the bacteria. The most common way of receiving the disease was being bitten by fleas, which had bitten rats, or in rare cases the disease could be transmitted by touching infected skin or by being coughed on by an infected person. In a lot of cases, the infected person's limbs would become gangrenous due to the disease clotting the blood and turning black. It would then need to be amputated, thus the plague being named the Black Death due to the high number of black limbs appearing on the infected. The Black Death is not seen as a big issue in our time due to our hygienic nature. We wash our hands and are able to produce antibiotics. Any rare outbreaks that do happen can be treated with antibiotics. However, when the plague originally broke out, medicine was still in its infancy, where leeches and bloodletting were seen as the most advanced form of medicine. And as such, they could not cope with the outbreak of the plague and had no cure. They did have plague doctors in the time, which were easily identifiable by these bird-like masks they would wear when visiting plague-stricken victims. The masks they wore were often stuffed with aromatic flowers and other such smelling objects, so that way they wouldn't have the smell of decaying flesh encumber their medical practice. They wore these masks at the time because it was part of their germ theory. They thought that germs could be transmitted through smell, and so doctors would be safe from infection by wearing these masks. Doctors at the time also had little understanding of what caused the disease, and as such, the best they could do would be to drain the limbs and drain the buboes. They'd use long sticks in order to not touch the infected skin. Though in general, if you had the plague, it was seen as a death sentence. The plague spread rapidly and broadly. Think about every zombie movie or TV show you have ever seen. How fast does the zombie outbreak spread? It's usually very rapidly. Generally in those types of media, a person gets bit by a zombie, and then after a brief incubation period, the infected dies, and then gets reanimated as one of the zombies. This was like the Black Plague. One person would get infected and then someone would try to help them, and by touching them, the bacteria would transfer to them, or they would get bitten by the same fleas that bit the infected person. Even though they were helping them, they were actually hurting themselves. And when they got infected, when they died, they didn't get reanimated, they just died. And this is how the plague spread, just like the zombie virus in every movie. Once a person had died, just like in zombie movies, it is best to burn the body to decrease the chance of infection to others from the disease. Thus it became a common practice to burn the bodies of the deceased. There are two popular theories on how the Black Plague spread from Asia to Europe. The first one is going via the Silk Road. At the time, there was a trade network between Asia and Europe in the West. And along this trade network, the rats and fleas would be transmitted from trader to trader and eventually ended up in the West. Another theory is that Mongolians from East Asia came across to Moscow and were attacking a city inhabited by Genosian traders. They sieged the city and the Mongols catapulted the dead soldiers over the walls of the city that the Genosians were in. And in doing so, the dead that they catapulted over were covered in the plague. It then spread to the Genossians, who, after fleeing the city, went to Europe and Constantinople, and that's how it spread from there. The plague spread from Asia to Europe to England. At this point, it was defined as a pandemic rather than epidemic, which means it affected more than 2 continents. The plague killed somewhere between 75 to 200 million people throughout Eurasia, but it is hard to determine due to death records not being accurate at the time. In general, it's believed that 20% of the population of Germany and England was killed by the plague. In most of Europe, it was considered that 50% of people were killed, and then in the Middle East is believed to be about a third of the population. Due to the high rate of death and the spread of the disease, it affected many social groups of the time differently. For instance, in Europe there was a group of religious fanatics called the Flagellants. This group felt that the Black Death was seen as a punishment from God and took it upon themselves to appease him. They would walk through Europe barefoot, whilst whipping themselves with scourges or sticks with spiked tails. These Flagellants were highly anti-Semitic and believed that Jewish people were the cause for the plague. Due to this anti-Semitism, Jewish people were often attacked, as Jewish people tended to live in separate parts of town compared to the other Europeans, and in a sense quarantined themselves, and in doing that were less affected by the plague. In Venice, they started the practice of isolating the infected on ships, until no one on board was left alive. These were called holding periods and tended to last 30 days, but if not everyone was dead, it would be extended to 40 days. This was called quarantine giorni in Italian, and is where the word quarantine derives from. In other parts of the world, they would merely avoid the infected. Some towns set up pestilence houses where infected could be taken to die. Others boarded up the houses of the infected so they could not escape. The others who could afford it fled to the countryside away from populated areas. Monasteries were also used as safe houses where people could take the infected in hope that the priest could cleanse the person of the illness. Again, it is not fully known how the Black Plague ended, but it is generally believed that these factors are what caused the demise of the plague. For starters, quarantine, keeping the infected away and isolated from the rest of the population, would help decrease the chance of infection. Having carts walk the street collecting the dead for mass graves and burning the bodies helped stop the spread of the disease. Another factor was hygiene. People began to wash more regularly, they burned the dead, and began boiling water before they drank it. This was before they knew anything of microbiology. The final factor was migration. During the time of the Black Plague, people became less nomadic, meaning that they wouldn't explore as much. As with each new town discovered along the journey came the risk of infection, and so people tended to stay inside their own homes and towns in order to stay safe. If you wish to know more about the Black Plague and the Black Death, check out the following websites. The first 2 are about the Black Plague itself, and the third is about comparing the plague versus the Ebola crisis. The final link is to a game called Plague Incorporated. It's basically a game that lets you create your own plague and release it around the world. It then shows the spread of the disease and how far and how quickly you can wipe out the population of the Earth. Thank you for listening and watching my talk on the Black Plague.